Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, amid cautious optimism for a ceasefire, one writer reminds us of the politics that failed Gaza.
Palestinians have had no choice but to be revolutionary, right? They've had no choice but to engage in this resistance.
Omar El Akkad wrote the book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. Is that day here? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave a comment telling us what you think about this episode. Are you hopeful about a lasting ceasefire? What do you make of the tone shift from U.S. officials on Gaza? And if you're listening to the podcast, be sure to leave us a review. It helps the show, and we appreciate it.
My name's Omar El Akkad. I'm a writer. I used to work as a journalist for about 10 years, and now I write novels and nonfiction.
Well, Omar, it is very nice to have you. Welcome to The Take. On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump announced the first phase of a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel, and news of the deal, which entails the release of captives and a rush of humanitarian aid into Gaza, was met with cheers from both Palestinians and Israelis.
As you can see, people and children in the background are chanting and celebrating these moments with joy. So finally, the sounds of the planes and bombing have disappeared.
Omar, you have been an outspoken critic of Israel's genocide in Gaza and of the West's backing of it. So what did it feel like for you to witness that moment after 2 years of genocide?
I think with the obvious caveat that I have the privilege of answering that question while sitting here on the launching side of the bombs, whereas your colleague does not. And I defer entirely to the reaction of these journalists who have been doing what, in my opinion, is the greatest journalism I have seen in my lifetime, and quite often paying with their lives for it. With that caveat, my reaction was similar to my reaction the last time there was a so-called ceasefire announcement, which is to say that anything that puts even a temporary pause on this carnage, on this slaughter, no matter how cynical I might be in the rest of my orientation towards this 2 years of genocide now, I have to take some measure of hope that there is at least a pause of some kind.
Yeah. Well, the news came from a Truth Social post from President Trump, who's treating this as a personal and a diplomatic win. And in the post, he even uses a quote from the Bible. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." How do you make sense of the fact that the United States is positioning itself as the peace broker, also knowing that very likely the only one who could have ended this, if it is indeed ended, is the United States?
I think there's been this kind of component to U.S. involvement in all of this that has gone on for decades, and it's a sort of fundamentally disjointed component, and disjointed is perhaps a bit too euphemistic of a word to use, but it's essentially something that boils down to this notion that the United States can act as sort of honest broker of peace while at the same time being overwhelmingly aligned with the nation state responsible for this occupation and this apartheid. And I think just fundamentally, just at a logical level, that doesn't work. Setting aside the moral level, should this ceasefire actually hold? I think there's going to be a monumental communal and institutional effort at forgetting, at essentially pretending as quickly as possible that this happened a very long time ago and that everybody needs to move on. And I think that that is, in many facets of society, going to be a deeply successful effort. And closely related to it, there's going to be a second effort, and that is going to be at limiting any measure of accountability for what we have seen every single day for 2 years. In any other context, you would imagine that somebody would be held to account. I know what it looks like when a little kid is shot in the head, because I have seen it dozens and dozens of times. I know what it looked like when an entire neighborhood is wiped out, when war crimes are committed day in, day out. And at some point, in anything resembling a morally functional society or world, there would be some measure of accountability for this. And I think there's going to be every effort to limit that, if not completely inhibit it. And I think the United States is going to be functional in that as well, because that is essentially the role that it has played for a very long time.
Well, after Israel launched its assault on Gaza, following Hamas's incursion into Israel, you tweeted a prediction. Can you take us back to that moment in October 2023 and what you said?
As you can tell by my answers, sort of short form is not my strong suit. I tend to ramble. But it was something to the effect of, one day when it's safe, when there's no one left to hold accountable, everyone will have always been against this. And of course, later on, I wrote a book that eventually took part of that as its title. And to me, it wasn't, a particularly profound thing to say. I tend to work in terms of analogy, right? And I was thinking, for example, how you can't really find a good South African liberal who will tell you that at one point they were in favor of apartheid. That person doesn't exist. You can't find a good American liberal who will tell you that at one point they were in favor of segregation. That a lot of those people in those photos, a lot of the people doing this are the liberals, are the centrists, are the, sort of high-minded, middle-of-the-road crowd. And I think that, it's very difficult for me to not foresee a day in the future when it becomes part and parcel of being a good liberal to express how opposed in hindsight you were to all of this horrible stuff that happened all the way back then. Which is why I think there's going to be an element of communal forgetting about this. Because the quicker we can get to the place where you can be upset about this in hindsight, the better and safer that will be for everyone involved.
Wow. Which will then give people license to say, stop bringing that up. That's in the past. It's over and dealt with. Well, you mentioned the tweet turned into a book. I have the book here. One day, everyone will have always been against this. We're now witnessing this massive public opinion shift. A Pew Research poll found 6 in 10 Americans have an unfavorable view of the Israeli government. And 39% say Israel's military is going too far in its operation against Hamas. Does it feel at all like you called it? That day is here?
In the last, 7 months or so since this book has come out, I've obviously talked to a lot of folks about it, and I think a lot of people took the title quite literally. There's plenty of people who are against this right now. I would argue, and I would propose that most of the world is against this right now. And I think there's going to be people who are in favor of it for the rest of their lives, who are actively cheering this on now and will actively cheer it on forever. When I was thinking of that particular title, I was thinking of a group of sort of mainstream liberal, that kind of ideology, right? And I think every day you see more and more people decide that this is the point where they want to have always been against it. I mean, over the summer, you saw a number of Western leaders wake up one morning and suddenly decide that the mass slaughter of human beings is bad. I would venture that this wasn't some revelation that they came to out of the blue. I would venture that their central mechanism of operating in the political world is self-preservation, but knowing how modular people's opinions can be, and how the central sort of driving mechanism for a lot of people is not right or wrong. It's acceptable or unacceptable. It's polite or impolite. It's what's going to have ramifications on my social circles or my career aspirations. I'm not indicting someone from afar. I'm sure I am this human being a lot of the time as well. But to see it play out in such a sort of flagrant way has, at least for me, sort of reoriented how I think about society at large and will have ramifications for the rest of my life.
Well, Omar, you describe Western liberals as transactional in this book, willing to side with the oppressed if there's something that they can get out of it. Donald Trump is also transactional. He explicitly talks about making deals. Is there a difference between these transactional approaches?
Look, a lot of life is transactional, right? But I think there is something uniquely infuriating about watching in the plainest sense possible something so coldly transactional being presented as virtuous. So, for example, earlier this year, I believe Donald Trump went and visited Saudi Arabia. Usually when U.S. leaders visit a place like Saudi Arabia, there is a kind of unspoken obligation to, at some point during that visit, say something about human rights. And then you watch Donald Trump go and not bother with any of that.
I want to thank His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, for that incredible introduction. He's an incredible man. Known him a long time now. There's nobody like him. Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much, my friend.
There is no stupid performance about human rights because everybody understands that that was never the concern to begin with. And so I understand that it is irrational to have so much of my rage directed at what is supposed to be the lesser of two evils, right? In the US, there are two political parties that stand a chance in hell of ever assuming power at the federal level, and you're supposed to side with the lesser of two evils. And I get that there is a strong negative reaction when I express frustration at what's supposed to be the lesser of two evils, but I know where I stand relative to a monster. A monster makes no effort to pretend to be otherwise. That is the fundamental difference here, is the performance. And in some ways, it's just almost refreshing to just have the transactional presented as such, as opposed to having it presented with this veneer of concern for morals and positions that clearly both the institution and the individual don't really care about when push comes to shove.
More with Omar after the break.
A young woman killed a stranger in South Korea because of her obsession with true crime stories. Her curiosity for dark tales became a deadly impulse to try out one of her own. Is the media responsible? Does true crime harm more than it helps? Hear the full story on True Crime Reports.
I want to talk more about that performance that you mentioned, because former officials from the administration of Joe Biden are now changing their tune on supporting Israel. Officials who put up a really good performance, making the world believe that they felt one way while they were in office and on screen. So Jake Sullivan, who was a national security advisor, said he supports withholding weapons for use in Gaza.
I think the case for withholding weapons from Israel today is much stronger than it was 1 year ago.
Former spokesperson Matthew Miller says he now believes Israel committed war crimes.
Do you think what's going on in Gaza now is a genocide?
I don't think it's a genocide, but I think I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes.
Now, others say the administration didn't do enough. I wonder what you make of these about faces and if anyone has talked to you about their own about face.
Yeah, I mean, look, I write for a living. Uncertainty is sort of what I traffic in. I'm rarely right about anything. And I think that there is a well-established pattern that is, it's evident in positions of injustice throughout history, but it is especially glaring with respect to Palestine because it is done so frequently. And that is for someone to come around to the self-evident, plainly obvious nature of this oppression, of this colonization, of every facet of what has been going on for the last 3/4 of a century the moment they have the word former in front of their job title. As soon as that happens, it's almost like this awakening. And again, I know that I come off as cynical when I talk about how empty that feels to me, but I can't help it. These are folks who had access to information to a degree of scale and scope that I never will, ever. It's not like they weren't aware of what was happening, and every now and then one of these world leaders will get caught on a hot mic giving their actual opinion about this, and then it becomes clear that they know as well as everybody else knows. But again, the central sort of driving mechanism is not right or wrong. The central concern is narrative. I am at the center of the story. And how do I make that story reflect as well as possible on me?
You told our producers ahead of our interview that you got a letter 2 weeks ago from someone who had that former in front of their name. What can you tell us about what they said?
So I used to be a journalist, and I know what answer I would be looking for in that question, which is like, give me names, right? Give me identifying information. I'm not going to do that because that's not fair. I think it was an honest note, which is to say that I think the person who wrote it felt the things that they were writing. One of the things that was interesting to me about it was that the entire interaction was so polite. It was civil. It was all of the things that in the part of the world I live in, whenever I'm in a room with power, and I used to be a journalist, so I would get into that room in a very sort of, adjacent sense. Mm-hmm. All of the things that are very, very, very important is to be civil and to be polite. And of course, there was a part of me that wanted to be deeply uncivil and wanted to be deeply impolite and wanted to yell, You were in a place where you could do something, right? There's this immense dichotomy that takes place where the people doing the most work to stand in the way of this atrocity, and I've done nothing. I've written a book. It does not matter in the slightest. I'm talking about people who have put their bodies on the line, who have hopped on boats to try and break a siege, who have tied themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers. When you talk to those folks, you will find some of the most abrasive, impolite, uncivil people, because they haven't looked away, they've seen the carnage, and it has made them deeply angry, as it should make all of us deeply angry. Mm. And then you go into the most oblivious, most powerful rooms, where people like this individual who sent me this note spend the vast majority of their time, and it is the nicest place. It's the most polite, most civil, most genteel environment. And I think if you are in a position where you're privileged enough to not have it be your neighborhood that's being razed to the ground, or your bloodline that's being wiped off the face of the earth, there is an immense allure to turn towards that polite, oblivious room, rather than to sit there with all of these deeply angry people who are shutting down freeways and yelling at the top of their lungs and making you feel uncomfortable.
Well, Omar, I just have a couple more questions before I let you go. You don't spare the Arab world from your critiques in the book. You grew up in Egypt and also in Qatar. How do you think they have changed in the last 2 years, these leaders of Arab nations, when it comes to what they've seen in their own backyard?
Yeah, the thing I've been saying a lot is that the last 2 years especially have made me lose a lot of respect for the governments of the Arab world. And that is saying something, because I didn't have much respect for these governments to begin with. But I think there's two things going on with Arab governments that I find particularly interesting. The first is that most of the time, at least on a narrative level, it is not in the best interest of these governments to explain how incredibly dependent they are on the good graces of the superpower that is largely greenlighting this genocide. It's not a great idea for the leader of Egypt or anywhere else in the Arab world to talk about how quickly those governments would collapse if the United States wished it to be the case. I don't think Arab governments are nearly as complicit in this as a lot of the other parts of the world are, particularly the Western world, but I do think they are partially complicit. And the other facet of it, I think, is that Palestinians have had no choice but to be revolutionary, right? They've had no choice but to engage in this resistance. And if you are the government of an Arab country and you know full well that you are running as a dictatorship, how interested are you really in supporting a revolutionary population? What if that revolutionary spirit becomes contagious, right? We're not that far removed from the Arab Spring, and I think a lot of Arab governments learned a lot from that moment. And so I think for those reasons, there's been something analogous to what we talked about earlier with respect to the difference, for example, between Democrats and Republicans, where there is a performance of a kind of virtue. And then in the back room, you get to, the cold, hard stuff. And I think that's what's happening here. And again, I understand the impulse, but that doesn't mean I have to respect it.
Yeah. Well, finally, Omar, your book documents both complicity in the genocide and the resistance to it. So we touched on that part earlier, but I want to delve in a little deeper for this final question. Because for the last 2 years, people have engaged in acts of resistance, from hanging a Palestinian flag to self-immolation in front of the Israeli embassy. What impact do you think that 2 years of inaction in the face of live stream genocide does to a generation coming of age?
I should say first and foremost that you're talking to somebody who most of the time is relatively spineless. And I need to leech courage where I can find it. So when you talk about these acts, they are, of course, incredibly important in of themselves, but they also radiate courage. And I've seen that. I've seen people take a position after seeing someone else take a position. I've been that person, right? There's been many, many times where I, in a vacuum, absolutely do not have the guts to stand for something that I believe in. And then I see someone who does. Courage and cowardice are contagious. And so in of itself, there is immense humanity to all of these acts. When I go talk to high school kids or college kids, overwhelmingly, there is nothing in this book I've written that they find remotely profound or revolutionary or out there, because they're watching the mechanism of reward and punishment in their society fall apart. It used to be, with my generation, a very well-established reward-punishment equilibrium. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and not only will you avoid punishment, but you will be rewarded. You'll be rewarded with a house in the suburbs and a 2-car garage and this life that in every material way is better than the one your parents had. And now, not only are these younger people watching one of the worst things I have ever seen in my life, not only are they watching this and knowing that in many cases, including in my case, my tax money is paying for this, but there is also no real reward for looking away. There is no house in the suburbs. You'll never be able to afford a house. There is no sort of stable middle-class post-war job. In fact, there might not even be a livable planet because of what we're doing to this climate. And so when that mechanism falls apart completely, the way one behaves, I think, is fundamentally different. There's going to be a massive communal effort at forgetting, led by many of the institutions that essentially did the cheerleading for this genocide. But I think particularly with younger folks, something has changed, and there's no going back from that.
Omar, you are slightly self-deprecating, but you were also just shortlisted for the U.S. National Book Award for this incredible book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, which I encourage everyone to go out and read. Thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.